Last March, heavy snow blanketed the northern part of the UK. That day, I wasn't working, and the morning was eerily quiet and freezing. Around 8:30 a.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to pick up some groceries and a few other essentials from a nearby shop. When I glanced outside, I saw that everything was buried under a thick layer of snow and ice. I went to my car and realized it was completely frozen, as I hadn't used it all day. Since the shop was close by, I decided against clearing the entire windshield. Instead, I just scraped off a small section, just enough to see while driving. A few minutes later, I locked my car and stepped into the grocery store. It was a small shop located at a busy crossroads that connected 4 different areas. Occasionally, they had great deals, so I browsed around. What started as a quick stop for a bottle of fizzy pop turned into me leaving with my hands full. Seeing me struggle, the shop assistant kindly helped me open the door. Normally, he would walk me to my car, but that night, he was busy and about to close up. To make things quicker, I decided to unlock my car from inside the store so I could head straight there. I thought this would save time, but it turned out to be a big mistake. As soon as I unlocked it, all the car lights switched on. Since it was pitch dark outside, at first, I was relieved. The parking lot had no lighting at all. As I walked toward my car, I noticed 2 men running from one side of the crossroads toward the shop. I didn't think much of it and simply opened the driver's door. As I placed my bags onto the passenger seat, I caught a glimpse of someone rushing past me. I assumed it was just one of the men heading into the store to escape the cold. I got into my car, shut the door, and was about to start the engine when I heard a knock on the passenger window. I turned to see a middle-aged man grinning widely, staring at me. His gaze was unsettling. Then, he suddenly burst into loud laughter and began yanking the door handle repeatedly, as if he expected it to open. My heart pounded as I quickly shifted the car into reverse. But the moment I did, my parking sensors blared. There was something behind me. Glancing at the rearview mirror, I froze. A second man stood directly behind my car, blocking my only way out. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. The only exit was backward, but I was too afraid to get out. My phone was at home, and the store was just a few minutes away, but it felt like an eternity. My mind raced for an escape plan. The man on the passenger side kept pulling at the handles, his face twisting into an angry glare. He then started banging on the windows, his eyes locked onto mine. I was terrified. Then, a sudden, violent crash. I turned and saw the man on my left had just kicked off one of my side mirrors. That was it. I knew I had to escape, no matter what. I slammed the car into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The man behind me barely jumped out of the way in time. As I turned to flee, the other man stepped right in front of my car. But I wasn't going to stop. I aimed straight at him. At the last second, he leaped aside, and I sped out of the parking lot, racing toward home as fast as possible. Knowing my car was easy to recognize, I parked a little farther from my house, just in case they had followed me. As I got out to check the damage, I noticed something worse. My front tire had been slashed with a knife. It was completely flat. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized what could have happened. Since they had damaged my car rather than trying to steal it, I don't think theft was their goal. More likely, when they saw the car lights turn on, they assumed I was an easy target, alone, in a dark, deserted parking lot with no way to escape. Now, I'm more cautious than ever. I only unlock my car when I'm standing right beside it and have changed the settings so that only the driver's door opens. I always check my surroundings before getting in and never sit in my car for too long after parking. Most importantly, I never visit that shop after dark anymore. No matter how short the trip, I won't take that risk again. Last year, after graduating from high school, I relocated to a new city. I spent a long time researching different colleges before finally choosing one about 3 hours away from my hometown. Wanting to live independently, I searched for an apartment and found a small place where I wouldn't have to share with anyone. It was in a safe neighborhood with friendly neighbors, and the rent was affordable for me. Plus, it was close to several parks, cafes, and a shopping district. For the first 4 months, everything was perfect. I felt completely secure, and nothing unusual happened. During that time, I became close friends with a guy from my college who lived just 5 minutes from my apartment. We often visited each other's places. One night, as winter was setting in, he called and invited me over to hang out and play video games. When I arrived, we set up the console and started a new game. We talked about our classes, shared funny stories, and listened to music in the background. Around 1 a.m., we decided to wrap up, and I headed back to my apartment. Once inside, I stepped out onto my balcony, which overlooked the building's entrance, to smoke. I glanced around and saw that no one else was outside. It was an icy winter night, and since it wasn't the weekend, most people were already indoors. The streets were nearly deserted, with only 1 or 2 cars passing by occasionally. The quietness made the night feel even colder, but also peaceful. After a few minutes, I decided to call it a night. I changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and switched off my bedroom lights. Just as I was about to get into bed, my doorbell rang. I froze in place, wondering who could be at my door at this hour. I tiptoed closer, pressing my ear against the door to listen. My first thought was that maybe my friend had come to return something I had left behind. But then I remembered, he would always text or call first if he was stopping by. I stayed quiet, waiting. After about 30 seconds, the doorbell rang again, followed by a few light knocks. My heart started racing. I stood completely still, trying not to make any noise that might reveal I was inside. I could hear the stranger shifting slightly outside my apartment before going still again. I hesitated before slowly lifting the peephole cover to take a look. The moment I saw what was on the other side, my legs nearly gave out. A dark figure in a hooded sweatshirt stood there, staring directly at me. His face was mostly hidden, with the hood pulled low and his hand gripping the zipper to cover the lower half of his face. All I could see were his forehead and piercing eyes. It was as if he had sensed my presence. Maybe he heard the peephole cover move, or perhaps he caught my nervous breathing. Suddenly, he shifted away from the peephole. The abrupt movement made my heart jump. Then, in a chillingly low voice, he spoke. "I know you're at the door." A shiver ran down my spine. I felt paralyzed with fear. But somehow, I forced myself to respond. "I'm calling the cops, man," I said, my voice shaking. He just let out a low, unsettling laugh. "Sure thing, big guy," he replied mockingly. Then, as if to erase any trace of himself, he wiped the door handle with his sleeve before walking away. The moment he disappeared, I grabbed my phone and called the police. When they arrived, they told me I wasn't the only one he had targeted. Apparently, he had been lurking around for at least a month, and they suspected he was involved in a home invasion case where a father had chased him out of a house. I was too shaken to stay in my apartment, so I crashed at my friend's place for a week. No matter how much time passed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night, the eerie way he covered his face, his disturbing laugh, and his cold, taunting voice. I kept checking the news, hoping to hear that he had been caught, but there was nothing. As the months went by, life started feeling normal again, but the memory of that night never fully left me. Now, a year has passed, and there's still no word about him. I have a feeling he simply moved on to another area, continuing his creepy behavior somewhere else. This isn't something that happened to me directly, but it's an experience my brother had back in 2013, one that we still talk about to this day. We're both from the northwest Highlands of Scotland, a remote and quiet area. That winter, we were both living there and working the same job, raising salmon. Winters in the Highlands can be brutal, with long nights, freezing temperatures, and powerful storms. Our village is tiny, with about 50 houses spread out along the coastline over a few miles. Beyond the few streetlights, there's mostly just open land covered in heather, the sea, and towering mountains on either side. At the time, I was living with my mom in her small stone house. It was warm, safe, and nothing strange ever happened there. My brother, on the other hand, was renting a much bigger house about half a mile up the road. It was an old building with around 6 bedrooms, sitting among trees at a bend in the road. Most of the rooms were empty, filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings, which gave the place an eerie feel. My brother mostly stuck to his living room and bedroom, and we had also converted one of the downstairs rooms into a gym, which we used together. One night, he was sitting alone, watching TV. It was a calm evening, no strong winds, no storms. His living room had a door that led outside, but it had been stuck shut for years and was never used. Suddenly, the handle started shaking violently, as if someone was gripping it and trying to force it open. The strange thing was that the rest of the door didn't move, only the handle rattled repeatedly. What made it even creepier was that the house had large windows, and from where he was sitting, my brother had a clear view of the area outside the door. If anyone had been there, he would have seen them immediately. But when he looked, the space outside was completely empty, there was no one there. After a while, the rattling stopped, but he had trouble sleeping that night. He's not someone who usually believes in the paranormal, so the fact that he seemed genuinely unsettled made me believe he was telling the truth. The next day, he still seemed shaken, as if the whole experience had really disturbed him. Later, I was in our gym, alone, working out in one of the downstairs rooms. While I was exercising, I suddenly heard a noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like slow, heavy footsteps, or something large being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening closely, trying to figure out what it could be. The house was old, so I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind moving through the empty rooms. Just beyond the trees behind my brother's house, slightly uphill and away from the road, stands an old ruined building from the 18th or 19th century. At night, the streetlights don't reach it, so it appears as a dark silhouette against the sky, giving it an eerie presence. When I lived there and took my mom's dog for walks, he would often stop, raise his fur, and growl in the direction of the ruin, especially after dark. The other abandoned buildings in the area never felt strange, they were close to the road and illuminated by the streetlights, making them easy to ignore. But that ruin was different. I always told myself that a deer or some other animal probably lived there, which is what unsettled the dog. Still, there was something about that place, its sharp, dark shape, the way it loomed in the distance, that made my mind wander. I'm from Australia, and I used to work the night shift at a 24-hour petrol station in a small town called Barham, located near the Murray River. It's a place where locals often share eerie stories about strange occurrences and ghostly sightings near the water. When I started the job, my coworker warned me not to be alarmed if I noticed odd shadows moving on the security cameras. The station was in a remote location and was especially quiet at night. The cameras ran constantly, and I could monitor the live feed on a small TV behind the counter. They showed the petrol pumps, the empty parking lot, and the surrounding darkness, where the shadows would sometimes shift and move. My boss mentioned that strange things often came and went near the petrol pumps, and at times, the overhead lights would flicker or suddenly go out. He told me not to think too much about it and suggested that if I ever felt uneasy, I could stay in the back room until a customer arrived. When I asked what these things were, he gave me a typical Aussie response: "They're not customers, they're not your friends, and bad things happen if you pay attention to them." That was the start of my first shift. Luckily, since I was new, they had assigned someone to work with me. But even with company, nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. By 2 a.m., things started to feel strange. The fridge light flickered occasionally, and the radio kept cutting out, breaking into bursts of static. But the most unsettling thing was what I saw on the security cameras. A figure was pacing back and forth, just outside the reach of the overhead lights near the pumps. Beyond that, the road was pitch black, stretching into complete darkness. Tony, the coworker on shift with me, also noticed the figure. He tried his best to ignore it, as if pretending it wasn't there would make it go away. But something about it didn't feel right. When a passing car's headlights shone in the exact spot where the figure had been, it vanished instantly. That's when I knew for sure, it wasn't a person. A few minutes later, a customer pulled up to fill their tank. When he came inside to pay, I did my best to act normal, trying to hide how shaken I was. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. I just saw something weird out there. I thought I saw someone, but when my headlights hit them, they were just gone. If that wasn't the understatement of the year, I don't know what was. That night stuck with me. I won't lie, I quit that job after just 4 days. I simply couldn't handle another night shift there. A few months later, I went to a bonfire at a friend's house on his parents' property, which we called the Go. The night was crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. We sat around the fire, tossing in garden waste, chatting, laughing, and enjoying a few drinks. Since it was a small town, you pretty much knew everyone, so I wasn't surprised to see Tony there. I knew I had to ask him about what had happened that night. As soon as we sat down together, I brought it up. "You got out of that place at the right time," he told me. I asked him what he meant, and if anything else had happened after I left. He hesitated before saying, "I saw the shadow pacing again. But then, it started calling my name." His usual relaxed demeanor shifted into something more serious. He wasn't just telling a story, this had deeply unsettled him. "It sounded like my grandmother," he admitted, "but she died when I was 12. For a moment, he just stared into the fire, lost in thought. Then he took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself, and continued. "After that night, it didn't stop. Every night, it would come back. Same voice, same words, calling me to come outside." The way he described it sent a chill through me. I could tell this wasn't just a bad memory, whatever he had seen, whatever he had heard, it had shaken him to his core. "I quit about 2 weeks after you did because of that," he admitted. "And I still can't get that voice out of my head. It sounded like my grandmother, but there was something wrong with it. It felt too sinister." I now live in Brisbane, and life in the city is completely different. But the strange experiences haven't stopped. That night sparked a deep interest in the paranormal, and I started researching logical explanations for things like this. Most so-called hauntings have rational causes. Still, there are a few experiences I've had that I simply can't explain, even to this day. But of all the places I've been, Barham will always be the most haunted place I've ever stayed.